The briefing room in the Wehrmacht headquarters building near Frankfurt smelled of coffee, cigarette smoke, and damp wool. Outside, November rain drummed against blackout curtains while inside, fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the large table where maps covered every inch of available space. It was the kind of cold that seeped through stone walls and settled into bones, the kind that made officers keep their greatcoats buttoned even indoors. Major Wilhelm Brenner stood among a dozen other officers, watching as senior staff moved colored pins across acetate overlays marking defensive positions, supply routes, and demolition points. The year was 1944, late autumn, and everyone in that room understood what these maps really meant. They weren't planning advances anymore. They were planning retreat. Brenner was 41 years old, a career officer who had served since before the war began. He'd been in Poland in 1939, France in 1940, and spent nearly 2 years on the Eastern Front before a shrapnel wound to his left leg earned him a reassignment to staff duties. The limp was barely noticeable now, but it had probably saved his life. Most of the men he'd commanded in Russia were dead. The briefing concerned Army Group B's defensive preparations along the Rhine. Allied forces were approaching from the west, and the strategic situation demanded hard decisions about which positions could be held and which needed to be abandoned. More importantly, it required decisions about what infrastructure would be destroyed to deny it to the advancing enemy. A colonel from the engineering corps was speaking, his voice methodical as he outlined demolition protocols. Bridges would be prepared for destruction. Railway installations would be disabled. Industrial facilities of military value would be rendered unusable. Fuel and ammunition stockpiles would be evacuated or destroyed. The colonel spoke in the careful euphemisms of military planning, but everyone understood the reality. German forces would be burning Germany itself to slow the Allied advance. Brenner had participated in dozens of such briefings. He'd watched the war's momentum shift from confident offensive operations to desperate defensive measures. He'd seen the maps change color as territories were lost, as the Reich contracted back toward its pre-war borders and then beyond them. He'd learned to read between the lines of official communications, to understand what wasn't being said as clearly as what was. The officers around the table represented different branches and specialties. Infantry colonels stood beside Luftwaffe liaison officers. Artillery commanders compared notes with logistics staff. They were professionals performing their duties, following orders from higher command, trying to make rational decisions in an increasingly irrational situation. At 0945 hours, a junior officer brought in new aerial reconnaissance photographs and updated intelligence assessments. The colonel paused his presentation while these materials were distributed. Brenner accepted a folder and began reviewing the contents, his practiced eye immediately recognizing the familiar patterns of military intelligence reports. The photographs showed road networks, river crossings, and industrial complexes. Each image was marked with coordinates and accompanied by notes about strategic value. Some locations were circled in red, indicating high priority for demolition. Others were marked with different symbols denoting varying levels of importance to defensive operations. Then Brenner opened to page 7 of the assessment, and his world stopped. The aerial photograph showed a river bend, a medieval bridge with 2 arches, a church steeple visible among clustered rooftops, and a distinctive Y-shaped intersection where the main road split to serve 2 valley routes. He'd walked that intersection 1,000 times growing up. He'd crossed that bridge every day going to and from the gymnasium. He'd sat in that church every Sunday until he left home at 18 to begin his military service. The typed notation in the margin read, Freudenbach. Bridge scheduled for demolition. Category 2 priority. Infrastructure destruction to commence upon initiation of retreat protocol. Freudenbach. His hometown. Population 3,200, mostly farmers and tradesmen, people who made their living from the land and from small workshops that had existed for generations. His parents still lived there, in the same house where he'd been born, where his father had taken over the family carpentry business from his grandfather. His sister lived 3 streets away with her husband and their 2 children. Brenner stared at the photograph. The bridge he'd played under as a boy, where he'd learned to swim in the slow-moving river. The market square where his mother still went every Saturday morning. The bakery that made the rye bread his father preferred. The school where he'd learned to read. All of it marked for destruction with the same clinical efficiency as any other military target. The colonel was speaking again, but Brenner couldn't hear the words. The room seemed to contract around him, the air growing thick and difficult to breathe. His hands held the folder steady through years of military discipline, but his mind was somewhere else entirely, in a small town in the Rhine Valley where someone had just drawn a red circle around everything he'd ever known. Around him, other officers continued taking notes, asking technical questions, discussing logistics and timing. The meeting proceeded according to its agenda, moving through item after item with practiced efficiency. Nobody noticed that one major standing near the back of the room had stopped hearing anything except the sound of rain against windows and his own heartbeat. To understand what Wilhelm Brenner felt in that moment, you need to understand what Freudenbach meant to him. Not just as a point on a map or a collection of strategic assets, but as the place that had formed everything he was before the uniform, before the war, before all of this. Freudenbach sat in a river valley between two forested ridges, protected from harsh winds and blessed with soil that farmers had worked for centuries. The town had existed in some form since medieval times, its growth limited by the valley's narrow confines and its economy based on the modest prosperity of agriculture and traditional crafts. Brenner's father, Johann, was one of 5 carpenters in the town, but his work was known for particular quality. The furniture that came from his workshop was sturdy and honest, built to last generations rather than seasons. Wilhelm had spent his childhood in that workshop, learning to read wood grain and respect tools, understanding that good work required patience and attention to detail that couldn't be rushed. His mother, Clara, came from a farming family 2 valleys over. She'd brought with her the practical wisdom of people who lived close to the land, who understood seasons and weather, who knew how to preserve food and stretch resources, who measured time not in hours but in harvests and holidays. The Brenner household ran with quiet efficiency, ordered by routines that had been passed down and modified across generations. Wilhelm had been an adequate student, neither brilliant nor struggling. He liked mathematics and history, found Latin tedious but manageable, and excelled at anything requiring physical coordination. He'd played football in the streets with other boys, gone hiking in the forests that covered the ridges above town, and spent summer afternoons swimming in the river until his skin pruned and his mother called him home for supper. The town had its rhythms, predictable and comforting. Church bells on Sunday mornings. Market day on Saturdays. The annual fair in September when families from neighboring villages came to trade livestock and goods. Christmas celebrations in the square. The spring festival when winter finally broke and farmers could return to their fields. There were personalities he remembered clearly. Herr Vogel, who ran the bakery and always had flour dust in his hair. Frau Schmidt, who managed the general store and knew everything that happened in town before anyone else. Pastor Weber, who gave long sermons that sent half the congregation into drowsy meditation. The town doctor who made house calls on a bicycle regardless of weather. The teacher who'd recognized Wilhelm's aptitude for mathematics and encouraged him toward higher education. Wilhelm's decision to pursue a military career had surprised some people. The Brenners weren't a military family. They were craftsmen, solid middle-class citizens who valued steady work and honest dealing. But in 1921, when Wilhelm graduated from the gymnasium, Germany was struggling economically, and military service offered security and structure that civilian life couldn't guarantee. His father had neither encouraged nor discouraged the choice. Johann Brenner wasn't a man who wasted words on hypotheticals. When Wilhelm announced his decision, his father had nodded once, asked if he was certain, and upon receiving confirmation, simply said, "Then do it properly." The Brenner workshop didn't produce shoddy work, and neither should a Brenner in uniform. Wilhelm left Freudenbach in the autumn of 1921, taking a train to Munich to begin officer training. He came home on leave several times a year initially, then less frequently as assignments and duties accumulated. His visits became occasions marked on the family calendar, times when his mother cooked special meals and his father closed the workshop early. Through the 1920s and into the 1930s, Wilhelm built a career while Freudenbach continued its modest existence. He married briefly, a Berlin woman who couldn't adapt to military life. The marriage ended after 3 years with no children and mutual relief. He advanced in rank through competence and steady performance rather than brilliance or connections. He served in various posts, accumulating experience in logistics, infantry tactics, and staff operations. When war came in 1939, Major Wilhelm Brenner was stationed with a logistics unit near the Polish border. He participated in the invasion not as a combat officer but as part of the supply chain that kept fighting units operational. He saw combat, but from the peculiar perspective of someone managing warehouses and transportation rather than leading men across fields under fire. France in 1940 was similar, a supporting role in a victory that seemed to validate everything German military doctrine had claimed. Then came Russia in 1942, and everything changed. The Eastern Front wasn't like France. It wasn't like anything Wilhelm had trained for or imagined. The scale of it, the distances, the weather, the desperation. Men froze to death in their sleeping bags. Supply lines stretched until they snapped. Orders came from officers hundreds of miles away who had no understanding of ground conditions. Wilhelm took shrapnel in his left thigh during a Soviet artillery barrage in the winter of 1943. The wound wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious enough to require evacuation and extensive recovery. By the time he was fit for duty again, the situation had deteriorated to the point where experienced officers were needed in staff positions rather than field commands. Through all of this, Freudenbach continued existing in that river valley. Wilhelm's letters home were censored carefully, revealing nothing of strategic value, but his family could read between the lines. His mother's responses spoke of everyday concerns: the harvest, his father's persistent cough, his sister's children starting school, the price of butter, a new family that had moved into the Hoffman house after old Herr Hoffman died. The war touched Freudenbach obliquely. Young men left and didn't return. Rationing imposed restrictions on daily life. News of defeats arrived disguised as strategic withdrawals. But the town itself remained physically untouched, too small and insignificant to attract enemy attention, too far from major industrial centers to matter in strategic planning. Until November 1944, when it appeared on a map in a briefing room near Frankfurt, marked for demolition with the same clinical efficiency as 100 other small towns whose only crime was existing along a defensive line. The briefing ended at 1,115 hours. Officers collected their materials and filed out, discussing technical details and timelines. Wilhelm Brenner remained standing at the table long after the room emptied, staring at the map spread before him, at the neat red circle around Freudenbach and the notation about bridge demolition. A captain from the engineering corps noticed him. "Something unclear about the protocols, Major." Brenner looked up, his face carefully neutral. "The timing for secondary target preparation." "How much advance notice?" "Depends on the situation. Could be days, could be hours. We prepare everything in advance, but final authorization comes from division level when retreat becomes necessary." The captain pointed to various marks on the map. "These Category 2 targets are second-wave demolitions. Critical infrastructure gets destroyed first to immediately impede enemy advance. Secondary targets follow as our forces withdraw through each sector." "And local populations? Evacuation procedures?" The captain's expression shifted slightly, a moment of humanity breaking through professional efficiency. "Not our area, I'm afraid. Civil administration handles that, if circumstances permit. But realistically..." He didn't finish the sentence. They both understood that evacuation of civilian populations would be chaotic at best, impossible at worst. "Is there a specific concern?" "No," Brenner said, the lie coming easily after years of practice. "Just clarifying protocols." The captain nodded and departed, leaving Brenner alone with the maps. He stood there another 10 minutes before carefully rolling up the documents he'd been assigned, tucking them under his arm, and walking out into the hallway where rain-blurred windows offered views of November gloom. His office was on the 3rd floor, a small room with a desk, filing cabinets, and a window that overlooked a courtyard. Brenner closed the door, set the folders on his desk, and sat down. The chair creaked. Outside, rain continued its steady percussion against glass. He opened the folder again to the photograph of Freudenbach. From this angle, the aerial perspective transformed everything familiar into abstract patterns. The bridge was just an engineering structure. The church was an assemblage of stone and mortar. The houses were tactical positions. The streets were potential approach routes. Military training had taught him to see terrain this way, to strip emotional content from tactical analysis. But he couldn't maintain that perspective. Looking at the photograph, he saw Frau Schmidt's store where he'd bought candy as a child. The square where he'd played football. The bridge where he'd fished with his father on Sunday afternoons. The church where he'd been confirmed at 15. The military logic was clear. The bridge was a legitimate target. If destroyed, it would delay enemy forces by forcing them to ford the river or bring up engineering equipment. Every hour of delay potentially saved German lives further back in the defensive line. Tactical doctrine was explicit: deny infrastructure to advancing enemy forces. But the bridge wasn't just infrastructure. Destroying it would cut the town in half, separating the western farms from the market square. It would isolate the elderly residents who lived on the far side, making it impossible for them to access the doctor or the store. It would transform a community into two fragmented pieces. And Freudenbach wasn't the only target. The demolition protocols included the grain mill, the railway siding, and the main road junction. By the time German forces finished denying infrastructure to the enemy, the town would be economically destroyed even if every building remained standing. Brenner pulled out a sheet of paper and began writing a letter to his father. The words came slowly, each sentence carefully constructed to pass censorship while conveying meaning his family could understand. Dear Father, work continues here with the usual demands. I hope the carpentry business remains steady despite current circumstances. I think often of home, particularly the old bridge and how it has served the town for so many generations. Such structures seem permanent until suddenly they are not. Mother should know that I am well and thinking of everyone there. Your son, Wilhelm. He sealed the letter, addressed it, and set it aside for the military post. It wouldn't arrive for days, maybe a week. And what could his father do with such vague warning anyway? Evacuate the family? Where would they go? The entire Rhine Valley was becoming a combat zone. There were no safe destinations, only different degrees of danger. Brenner spent the rest of the day performing his assigned duties. He reviewed supply reports, signed requisition forms, attended another briefing about ammunition distribution. He ate lunch in the officers' mess without tasting the food. He maintained the professional demeanor that had carried him through 23 years of military service. But underneath that facade, his mind worked through possibilities and impossibilities. He could request a transfer, get himself assigned somewhere far from this particular decision. But that would only mean someone else would implement the demolition protocols, someone for whom Freudenbach was just another point on a map. He could sabotage the operation somehow, delay or prevent the bridge's destruction. But that would be treason, punishable by death, and it wouldn't save the town if enemy forces were actually advancing through the valley. He could warn the town more explicitly, send detailed information that would clearly violate security protocols. But such a warning would put his family in danger along with himself. The Gestapo took security breaches seriously, and association with a traitor would destroy everyone connected to him. Or he could do nothing. Follow orders. Let the war machine proceed according to its logic. Accept that he was one small cog in a vast mechanism, incapable of affecting outcomes that were determined by forces far beyond his control or responsibility. The rain continued. The day dimmed toward evening. Brenner sat in his office long after duty hours ended, staring at the map, at the photograph, at the neat professional notations that transformed human lives into tactical considerations. 3 days after the briefing, Brenner was assigned to inspect forward supply depots along the Rhine defensive line. The assignment took him through territory he knew from childhood, past towns similar to Freudenbach, through valleys where farmers were bringing in late autumn harvests while German engineers prepared their bridges for demolition. He saw explosive charges being fitted to stone pillars that had supported river crossings for centuries. He watched as military convoys rolled through village streets, their presence transforming quiet communities into potential battlegrounds. He spoke with local commanders who discussed defensive positions with the same professional detachment he'd been trained to maintain. In one town, a colonel showed him the demolition preparations for a railway bridge. The charges were expertly placed, the detonation sequence carefully designed to drop the entire structure into the river with maximum efficiency. The colonel was proud of the engineering, explaining the calculations and fail-safes with technical enthusiasm. Of course, it will be a disaster for the locals, the colonel admitted. That bridge services 3 farming communities. Without it, they'll have to travel 30 kilometers to the next crossing. But that's not our concern. Our job is denying infrastructure to the enemy. Brenner asked about civilian evacuation. The colonel shrugged. Civil administration's responsibility. We've been told they're developing plans, but whether those plans will be implemented effectively. Another shrug. Both men understood that civil administration was increasingly a fiction. The machinery of ordinary governance was breaking down as military necessity consumed everything. That evening, Brenner stood on a hillside overlooking the Rhine, watching the sun set over water that flowed dark and heavy between forested banks. Somewhere downstream, perhaps 20 kilometers, Freudenbach sat in its valley, unaware that its fate had already been decided by men in offices who'd never walked its streets. He thought about his father's workshop, about wood shavings and the smell of linseed oil, about patient hands shaping timber into furniture that would outlast wars and borders and political systems. He thought about his mother's garden where she grew vegetables and flowers with equal care. He thought about his sister's children, 9 and 7 years old, who'd known nothing but war and rationing and the fear that colored everyone's existence now. The strategic logic was clear. Germany was losing the war. These defensive measures would delay but not prevent eventual defeat. The bridge at Freudenbach, along with thousands of other bridges, would be destroyed. Towns would be damaged. Civilians would suffer. And none of it would change the ultimate outcome. But military logic demanded that each position be defended, each retreat conducted in good order, each bridge demolished at the proper moment. Not because victory was possible, but because that was what discipline required. Orders were followed not because they made sense but because the alternative was chaos. Brenner had spent his entire adult life in this system. He'd sworn oaths, followed regulations, maintained standards. He believed that military discipline, properly applied, could impose order on the fundamentally chaotic nature of war. He believed that professional competence and careful adherence to established procedures could minimize suffering even while accomplishing military objectives. Now he was being asked to apply that same professional competence to destroying his own hometown. He returned to headquarters the following day and requested a meeting with his commanding officer, Colonel Hartmann. The colonel was a career officer like Brenner, professional but not unkind, someone who'd survived by competence rather than political connections. Brenner entered the office, saluted, and stood at attention. "Permission to speak frankly, sir." Hartmann looked up from paperwork. "Granted. The demolition protocols for the Rhine defenses. Specifically regarding Freudenbach. Sir, I must inform you that Freudenbach is my hometown. My family still resides there." Hartmann set down his pen. A long silence filled the office. "I see. You're requesting what, exactly?" "I don't know, sir. I felt it necessary to disclose the conflict of interest." Another pause. Hartmann leaned back in his chair. "Major, I appreciate your honesty. However, the situation is as follows: these protocols were developed at Army group level. Implementation will proceed according to established timelines. Your personal connection to one target among hundreds doesn't alter strategic necessity." "I understand, sir." That said, Hartmann continued, "if you wish to request a transfer to a posting that wouldn't involve your hometown's defensive sector, I would support such a request. I cannot guarantee it would be approved, but I would support it." Brenner considered this. A transfer would be cowardice disguised as protocol. It would remove him from the decision but wouldn't save the town. Someone else would sign the orders, push the button, blow the bridge. His absence would change nothing except his own guilt. "Thank you, sir. I'll consider the option." "Brenner," Hartmann said, his tone shifting slightly towards something less formal. "This war has forced us all into impossible positions. We do our duty as best we can and hope that somehow, despite everything, that duty means something. I won't pretend to have answers about how you reconcile professional obligations with personal connections. But I will say this: whatever decision you make it deliberately. Don't let events choose for you." Brenner saluted and left. Back in his office, he sat at his desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. He wrote another letter to his father, even more carefully worded than the first. "Dear Father, I mentioned in my previous letter thinking about the bridge. I want to add that I hope very much that Mother and you, along with Anna and her family, will consider visiting Aunt Greta in Freiburg this winter. I know travel is difficult, but it would ease my mind to know you are spending time away from home for a while. Your son, Wilhelm." Aunt Greta didn't exist. Wilhelm had no relatives in Freiburg. But his father would understand the message: leave. Evacuate. Get out while you can. Whether his father would act on such vague warning, Wilhelm couldn't know. Whether it would even matter, he couldn't predict. All he could do was send the letter and return to his assigned duties, implementing the same demolition protocols that would destroy everything he'd grown up knowing. The military situation deteriorated steadily through December. Allied forces pressed against the Rhine defenses from multiple directions. Wehrmacht units conducted fighting withdrawals, abandoning positions according to pre-planned sequences, destroying infrastructure as they fell back. Brenner received updates hourly. Sector after sector reported enemy contact. Bridges were demolished on schedule. Towns were evacuated when possible, abandoned when not. The front line rolled eastward like a slow-motion tide, consuming everything in its path. Freudenbach's position on the demolition schedule moved from theoretical to imminent. The bridge was now designated for destruction within 72 hours, pending tactical developments. Engineer units were already in position with prepared charges. Artillery spotters had surveyed approach routes. Local Wehrmacht elements knew their withdrawal protocols. Brenner stood in the operations room, watching colored pins move across maps, each representing units of men whose lives depended on decisions made by officers like him. The professional part of his mind tracked tactical developments with practiced efficiency. The human part screamed at the clinical detachment required to push representations across paper while towns burned in reality. He'd received one response to his letters. A brief note from his father: "Received your correspondence. Business keeps us occupied. Mother sends her regards. Your father." Nothing about evacuation. Nothing suggesting the family had any intention of leaving. Either they didn't understand the danger, or they'd chosen to remain regardless. At 1430 hours on December 18, Colonel Hartmann summoned him. "Allied forces have broken through 2 sectors north of your hometown. We're implementing accelerated withdrawal protocols. Demolition teams are being activated ahead of schedule. Freudenbach's bridge. 24 hours, possibly less. Depends on enemy advance rate." Hartmann paused. "You should know that civil authorities attempted to organize evacuation 2 days ago. Results were mixed. Perhaps half the population left. The rest." Another pause. "The rest chose to remain in their homes." Brenner absorbed this information. His parents were likely among those who stayed. His father was 68, his mother 64. Where would they go? How would they travel? The roads were clogged with military traffic and refugees. Temperatures were dropping toward winter freezing. Leaving meant abandoning everything they'd built across lifetimes. "I need someone to coordinate with the demolition team," Hartmann continued. "Someone familiar with the local geography who can ensure the charges are placed for maximum effectiveness while minimizing excess damage." He was asking Brenner to personally oversee the destruction of his hometown's bridge. To use his intimate knowledge of the area to help the engineers do their job more efficiently. To be directly responsible for cutting Freudenbach in half. "Sir. I know what I'm asking, Major. I'm asking you to do your duty despite personal cost. I'm asking you to be a soldier when being a soldier requires something inhuman. And I'm telling you that if you decline, I'll understand and assign someone else who won't give a damn about that bridge or that town. Your choice." Brenner stood very still. The operations room hummed with controlled activity around them. Radio operators spoke into headsets. Staff officers moved pins and updated logs. The machinery of war continued its relentless function regardless of individual dilemmas. He thought about unknown engineers placing charges on his town's bridge. Strangers who would follow technical manuals without understanding that the stone pillars they were wiring for demolition had stood for 300 years. Who wouldn't know that generations of children had learned to swim in the water flowing beneath those arches? Who couldn't imagine the countless crossings that bridge had facilitated, the daily traffic of ordinary life? If it had to be destroyed, and apparently it did, then maybe it should be destroyed by someone who understood what was being lost. Someone who would at least bear witness to the annihilation, who would carry that memory forward as testimony that this place had mattered, these people had existed, this life had been real before war consumed it. "I'll do it," Brenner said. Hartmann nodded once. "God help us all." Brenner left headquarters at 0600 hours on December 19, riding in a staff car through winter morning darkness toward a place that existed in his memory as eternal summer afternoons but in reality was about to cease existing at all. The drive took 3 hours through traffic that testified to total military collapse. Columns of troops marched east, faces blank with exhaustion. Vehicles crammed with equipment and refugees competed for road space. Abandoned hardware littered the shoulders, trucks that had run out of fuel, artillery pieces too damaged or heavy to retreat further. As they approached the valley, Brenner saw the first signs of recent combat. Shell craters in fields. A farmhouse collapsed into rubble. Trees shattered by explosions. The war was close now, perhaps only kilometers behind them. The staff car descended into the valley, and suddenly Freudenbach appeared below, looking impossibly normal despite the apocalypse rolling toward it. Smoke rose from chimneys. The church steeple stood sentinel over clustered rooftops. The river wound through its ancient course, crossed by the stone bridge that Brenner had come to destroy. They drove through town slowly. The streets were nearly empty, but Brenner saw faces at windows, people watching the military vehicle pass with expressions that mixed fear, resignation, and something like accusation. They knew what was coming. Everyone knew. The bridge rose ahead, its twin arches elegant despite age and weathering. German engineers had already established a perimeter, keeping civilians back while they worked. Brenner exited the vehicle and approached the officer in charge, a young captain named Weiss who looked tired beyond his years. Major Brenner, from division staff. I'm here to coordinate demolition protocols. Weiss saluted with relief. Thank God. We've been waiting for authorization. The charges are placed and tested. We're ready to blow on your order. Brenner walked onto the bridge, his boots echoing on stone that had supported his footsteps 1,000 times before. The engineers had worked efficiently. Explosive charges were fixed to key structural points, wires running back to a detonator position 30 meters away. Everything was professional, textbook perfect. He looked upstream, toward the bend where he'd learned to swim as a boy. Downstream, toward the mill that had ground the valley's grain for centuries. North, toward the church where his parents had married in 1902. South, toward the workshop where his father had shaped wood into furniture that would outlast this war and the next. Major? Weiss prompted. Your assessment. It's adequate. Well placed. The technical evaluation came automatically. You've accounted for the current water level variations. Yes, sir. The structure will drop cleanly. Complete denial of the crossing to enemy vehicles. And the town. Collateral damage projections. Weiss looked uncomfortable. Difficult to predict. The blast is shaped to direct force downward and outward into the river. But the buildings on the near bank. He didn't finish. Brenner understood. The explosion would shatter windows. Flying stone might damage structures within 50 meters. The psychological impact on remaining civilians would be devastating. They would watch their lifeline to the outside world destroyed while enemy forces approached from the opposite direction. Evacuation status. Roughly half departed over the past week. The rest. Weiss gestured vaguely toward the town. Elderly, mostly. People who couldn't or wouldn't leave. And some who think German forces will stabilize the line, hold this valley. They wouldn't. Brenner knew the tactical situation. This was a delaying action at best. The bridge would be blown, German forces would withdraw another 5 or 10 kilometers, and Freudenbach would be abandoned to whatever happened when two armies collided around a town that had never asked to be strategically significant. At 1,400 hours, artillery rumbled in the distance. American forces, probing defenses to the west. Weiss checked his watch. Sir, we should consider authorization. If enemy forces advance faster than expected. I'm aware, Captain. Brenner walked off the bridge and up the street toward the market square. He told himself he was conducting a final assessment. In reality, he was saying goodbye to a place that would exist only in memory after today. The square was deserted except for an old woman sitting on a bench near the fountain. She looked up as Brenner approached, her eyes sharp despite age. You're Johann Brenner's boy. Wilhelm. He was startled that she recognized him. Frau Müller. I taught your mother when she was a girl. She studied his uniform, the major's insignia, the staff officer's tabs. You're here about the bridge. It wasn't a question. Brenner found himself unable to speak. My husband was a soldier in the last war, Frau Müller continued. He talked about how officers made hard decisions, how someone had to choose what to sacrifice to save what could be saved. I never understood what he meant until now. I'm sorry, Brenner managed. For what? Doing your duty. Being who you've become. She smiled, but there was no joy in it. Your parents refused to leave. Your father said that if the workshop was going to be destroyed anyway, he preferred to be here when it happened. Stubborn man. Takes after his son. The artillery rumbled again, closer now. Brenner could hear small arms fire mixed with the heavier sounds. Time was running out. Is there anything? He couldn't finish the question. That you can do? No, dear. What's going to happen will happen. We made our peace with that when we chose to stay. Just. She paused, choosing words carefully. Just remember that this place was real. That we lived here. That it mattered, even if it's about to stop existing. Brenner nodded, unable to trust his voice. He turned and walked back toward the bridge, each step weighted with the accumulated mass of 41 years of memory. Captain Weiss was waiting. Major, we have reports of enemy armor within 2 kilometers. Authorization to proceed? Brenner looked at the bridge one final time. Stone arches that had weathered 300 winters. Water flowing beneath them as it had before the bridge existed and would after. The town beyond, sleeping in its valley, unaware that in moments it would be severed from itself. Proceed with demolition. The detonation sequence was almost anticlimactic in its efficiency. Captain Weiss positioned his men at safe distance, verified all civilians were clear of the danger zone, and checked the electrical connections one final time. He looked to Brenner for final confirmation. Brenner nodded. Weiss turned the key and pushed the plunger. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the charges detonated in perfect sequence, each explosion precisely timed to maximize structural collapse. The stone bridge that had stood for 3 centuries seemed to hesitate, as if shocked by this violence. Then physics asserted itself. The twin arches buckled. Stone that had supported countless crossings crumbled under forces it was never designed to withstand. The roadway sagged, tilted, and dropped into the river with a roar that echoed off valley walls. Water surged upward in massive displacement, raining down on both banks. Dust and smoke obscured everything for long moments. When the air cleared, the bridge was gone. In its place, jagged remnants protruded from churning water like broken teeth. Stone blocks that had been fitted together by medieval masons lay scattered across the riverbed. The connection that had united Freudenbach as 2 halves for 300 years had been erased in 3 seconds. Brenner stood among the engineers, watching water reclaim its unobstructed channel. On the far bank, he could see people emerging from buildings, staring at the destruction. Some were crying. Others simply stood in shock, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. His parents' house was 3 streets from the river. He couldn't see it from here, but he imagined his father standing in the workshop, feeling the explosion shake walls, understanding what it meant. His mother in the kitchen, perhaps looking at the photograph of her son in uniform that she kept on the mantel, wondering how the boy who'd played under that bridge had become the man who ordered its destruction. Demolition successful, Weiss reported, his voice flat. Bridge completely impassable to vehicular traffic. Estimated delay to enemy forces, 6 to 8 hours before they can establish alternative crossing. 6 to 8 hours. That was what Freudenbach's bridge had been worth. A temporary inconvenience to advancing armies. The engineers would note it in their reports as a successful demolition, properly executed according to protocol. Higher command would factor those 6 to 8 hours into their calculations about defensive fallback positions. Nobody would record that a town had just been split in half. That elderly residents on the western bank were now cut off from the doctor, the store, the church. That farmers couldn't bring their produce to market. That families were separated. That a community's cohesion had been shattered along with stone and mortar. Artillery fire was clearly audible now. American forces were advancing faster than predicted. Weiss ordered his engineers to pack up equipment and prepare to withdraw. The demolition team would fall back to the next position, where they would blow another bridge, destroy another road junction, deny another piece of infrastructure to the enemy. Brenner watched them work with mechanical efficiency, each man performing his assigned role. This was what war reduced people to, specialists in destruction, professionals at annihilation, experts at erasing the physical manifestations of civilization. At 1,545 hours, the first American reconnaissance vehicles appeared on the western ridge. Wehrmacht forces opened fire from prepared positions. The brief firefight sounded like firecrackers compared to the bridge's thunderous collapse. The American vehicles withdrew, but everyone knew they'd return in force. Weiss approached Brenner. "Sir, we need to withdraw now. Enemy contact is imminent." "Go. I'll follow shortly." Weiss looked like he wanted to protest but knew better than to question a superior officer. He saluted and departed with his men, leaving Brenner alone on the riverbank, watching water flow past the bridge's ruins. He thought about writing one more letter to his parents, explaining why he'd done what he'd done, trying to justify the unjustifiable. But what could he possibly say? That military necessity demanded it. That he was following orders. That strategic logic left no alternative. All true. All meaningless. The truth was simpler and more terrible. He'd chosen his duty to the Wehrmacht over his duty to the place that had made him who he was. He'd chosen obedience to military hierarchy over loyalty to home and family. He'd chosen to be a soldier when being human would have required refusing, regardless of consequences. And now the bridge was gone. The town was divided. His parents were trapped in a combat zone. And he stood on the bank of a river that had once seemed permanent, eternal, unchangeable, watching it prove that nothing human-made survives the collision of armies. American artillery began ranging shots, searching for Wehrmacht positions. Shells landed upstream, throwing up geysers of water and mud. Brenner finally turned away from the river and walked back to his staff car, leaving Freudenbach behind for what he knew would be the last time. As the vehicle climbed out of the valley, he looked back once. The town lay below, smoke rising from several buildings now, the church steeple still standing sentinel over ruins and refugees and the unbridgeable gap where connection used to be. He never saw Freudenbach again. The war continued another 4 months after Brenner destroyed his hometown's bridge. Wehrmacht forces conducted their organized retreat, trading space for time, demolishing infrastructure according to plan. American and Soviet forces pressed inward from multiple directions. The Third Reich contracted day by day until it finally collapsed entirely in May 1945. Major Wilhelm Brenner survived. He was neither captured nor killed. He simply continued performing his assigned duties until there were no more duties to perform, no more orders to follow, no more bridges to blow. When the Wehrmacht officially surrendered, he found himself in a displaced persons camp near Munich, one of millions of Germans trying to understand what their country had become. He learned of his parents' fate through a letter from his sister that reached him 3 months after the war ended. Anna had evacuated with her children before American forces took Freudenbach, but their parents had refused to leave. They'd stayed in the house where they'd raised their children, where Johann Brenner's workshop stood full of half-finished furniture that would never be completed. American forces had encountered fierce resistance in the valley. Artillery exchanges damaged significant portions of the town. Johann and Clara Brenner's house took a direct hit from a stray shell during the fighting. Both died instantly, buried in the rubble of the home they'd refused to abandon. Anna's letter was factual, almost clinical in its restraint. She described the deaths, the hasty burials, the chaos of those final days. She mentioned that she'd returned to Freudenbach after the fighting ended, found the workshop destroyed, salvaged what few possessions remained. She never explicitly blamed Wilhelm for their parents' deaths, but the accusation was implicit in every sentence. The bridge was eventually rebuilt. Not the medieval stone arches, but a modern concrete structure erected by American engineers as part of reconstruction efforts. It served the same functional purpose, spanning the same river, connecting the same 2 halves of town. But it wasn't the same bridge. It could never be the same. Brenner never returned to Freudenbach. After his release from the displaced persons camp, he settled in Hamburg, working as a clerk in an export firm. He never married again. He maintained minimal contact with his sister, sending Christmas cards and occasional letters that were answered with similar brevity. He lived quietly, anonymously, one of millions of Germans trying to forget the war while living with its consequences. He kept no photographs of Freudenbach, no mementos from his childhood, nothing that might trigger the memory of that December afternoon when he stood on a riverbank and ordered the destruction of everything he'd once known. But memory requires no physical prompts. Late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, he would lie in his small apartment and see that bridge. Not as it appeared in the aerial photograph, reduced to geometric patterns of strategic significance, but as he'd known it as a boy. The smooth stones worn by centuries of footsteps. The cool shade under the arches on summer afternoons. The sound of water flowing beneath. He would remember his father's workshop, the smell of wood shavings and linseed oil, the patient precision of hands shaping timber into furniture meant to outlast generations. He would remember his mother's garden, her careful tending of vegetables and flowers, the quiet pride she took in useful beauty. And he would remember standing among engineers while charges detonated, watching stone crumble, hearing the explosion echo off valley walls, knowing that he'd chosen duty over home, orders over family, military logic over human loyalty. The question that haunted him wasn't whether he'd made the right choice. Military discipline doesn't deal in right and wrong, only in following orders or refusing them. The question that kept him awake in Hamburg nights was whether there had actually been a choice at all. Could he have refused? Technically yes. The consequences would have been severe: court-martial, execution, disgrace for his entire family. But those were just consequences, not impossibilities. Plenty of officers had refused orders during the war, accepting punishment rather than complying with what they considered unconscionable commands. Brenner hadn't refused. He'd rationalized instead. He'd told himself that if he didn't blow the bridge, someone else would. That his intimate knowledge of the town allowed him to minimize collateral damage. That following orders was what soldiers did, what made military organization possible, what separated disciplined forces from armed mobs. All true. All self-serving justifications for destroying the place that had made him who he was. In 1958, 13 years after the war ended, Brenner received a letter from Freudenbach as mayor. The town was planning a memorial ceremony for residents who died during the war years, and the mayor was attempting to contact surviving family members. Would Herr Brenner, as the remaining Brenner family representative, care to attend the commemoration of his parents? He read the letter 3 times, then filed it away unanswered. In 1965, his sister Anna died of heart failure. Brenner attended the funeral in Stuttgart, where Anna had rebuilt her life. Her children, now adults with families of their own, were polite but distant. They knew who their uncle was, the Wehrmacht officer who'd been posted near Freudenbach during the war, whose parents died when American forces took the town. Whether they knew the specific details, that he'd personally ordered the bridge demolition, Brenner couldn't tell and didn't ask. He lived until 1979, dying at age 76 from complications of pneumonia. His estate was minimal: some furniture, a small savings account, boxes of papers that mostly consisted of employment records and tax documents. Among those papers, the executor found a single photograph, an aerial reconnaissance image of a bridge over a river, marked with tactical notations and demolition protocols. The executor, not understanding its significance, nearly discarded it. But something about the careful way it had been preserved, protected in a cardboard folder, kept separate from other documents, suggested importance. The photograph was eventually donated to a military history archive, where it sits today, catalog number WHR 1944-12 RHN 0847, one of thousands of similar images documenting Wehrmacht defensive operations during the war's final months. Researchers occasionally examine it while studying Rhine defense strategies or engineering demolition techniques. They note the precise placement of charges, the efficiency of the destruction sequence, the professional competence demonstrated by German forces even in retreat. They might comment on the picturesque town visible in the background, preserved for posterity before being caught in the advancing war. What they never see, because military records don't document such things, is the story of a man who stood on a riverbank and destroyed his own childhood. Who chose duty over home, military discipline over human loyalty, following orders over following conscience. Who lived another 34 years carrying that decision like a stone he could neither set down nor share. The bridge at Freudenbach still stands. The modern concrete structure serves the town adequately, carrying traffic across the same river that flowed beneath medieval stone arches. The town itself has long since healed its physical wounds, rebuilding what was destroyed, continuing the patient work of ordinary life. But somewhere in military archives, among countless photographs of demolished bridges and destroyed towns, one image preserves the moment before, when stones still stood, when water still flowed beneath intact arches, when a place still existed whole, before someone who knew it intimately gave the order that erased it forever. The photograph doesn't show Major Wilhelm Brenner standing on the bank, watching engineers work, carrying the weight of command in a war that reduced everything to tactical necessity. It doesn't show his face when the charges detonated, or his silence during the drive back to headquarters, or the decades of nights he spent remembering what he'd done. It only shows the bridge. And that, perhaps, is all that history requires: evidence that something existed, proof that it was destroyed, and the implicit understanding that such destruction required human decisions, human actions, human choices, even when those choices seemed to offer no alternative but compliance with the inevitable machinery of war. The bridge is gone. The man who destroyed it is gone. The town has moved forward, built new connections, continued existing as places do regardless of what history inflicts upon them. Only memory remains. And memory, unlike bridges, can never be demolished by engineers or erased by advancing armies. It persists despite, or perhaps because of, the pain it causes, testimony to the fact that what happened mattered, that choices had consequences, that the line between duty and destruction was always thinner than military discipline wanted to acknowledge. Wilhelm Brenner understood this in the end. It's why he kept the photograph, preserved carefully among otherwise unremarkable papers. Not as memorial or justification, but as evidence. Proof that it had been real, the bridge, the town, the moment when command demanded that he choose between being a good soldier and being a good son, and he chose as soldiers are trained to choose. Whether he was right to do so, or whether any alternative existed that wouldn't have ended in similar destruction, history will never resolve. All we know for certain is that on December 19, 1944, Major Wilhelm Brenner gave an order, engineers turned a key, and a bridge that had stood for 300 years disappeared in 3 seconds. The rest, the guilt, the memory, the 34 years of living with that moment, those belonged to him alone, carried privately until death, documented nowhere except in the careful preservation of a single photograph showing what once existed and what his command destroyed.